Hey, we're going to be looking at chapter 26 and Seiko with Truman in the Cold War tonight. So let's get started right away. This is basically the start of period 8. Period 8 in the exam goes from 1945 to 1980. It makes about 15% of the exam and typically covers Cold War, 50s, Civil Rights era, the Vietnam War, which is not in there, and also the 70s and Nixon. It goes basically all the way up to the time of Reagan. Typically, this is where you're going to get your last big writing assignment. Typically, the DBQ and the LEQ will typically not go into the 1980s or 90s. Sometimes the LEQ or DBQ will touch on Reagan and some modern day things, but I've only seen that once. Only one time have I seen a DBQ get into the 1980s at any point. For the most part, we can see our writing end at this point. At some point, they will be having some LEQs and SAQs at the same time in the period 9, but so far, it's most of the bulk of it is stopping at period 8. Also, on the modified version of the test, if we do an online version this year, most likely the AP will not be pushing very late in the curriculum, is my guess. Last year, they cut off all the curriculum basically at the progressive era. And this year, I think they would at least extend that a little bit, but I could see them not pushing all the way into the 1980s on this year's test in 2020 because of COVID. But we'll see. We'll have to see what they come up with at the very end when we get a little closer to May. Let's get to it. So post-war America, we're going to divide this into sort of like 3 sections. We're going to see post-war America, post-war politics, and then post-war foreign diplomacy. With the bulk of this really talking about the Cold War and foreign diplomacy. But again, post-war America, basically we had huge amounts of soldiers coming home from the war. About 15 million soldiers came home to civilian life. And because of them coming home and us winning the war, and also Europe being really devastated, it really set up America to be an extremely advantageous position in world politics and world economy. Americans had been saving during the war. Many Americans did not lose their lives comparatively. There's really no major attack on American soil besides Pearl Harbor. That was just the naval area. Besides the people who died during the war, Americans' lives were not nearly affected in a hugely drastic way. Yes, we had the Japanese internment, we had rationing and shortages and other things like that, but we didn't have major battles and major bloodshed and other things that wars bring to their civilians like Europe did and Japan did and China did and Russia did. And so it really set up America to have a really advantageous point in global politics and also the economy. And America had a huge economic boom this time period. And one of the reasons why is that because many Americans had been saving money during the war because of all the shortages and the rationing. They basically saved their money rather than spending it. And that really sort of showed good times to come. And during the 1950s, basically Americans achieved one of the highest standards of living of all time, especially white Americans. Again, we're going to talk about how minorities and African Americans saw America very differently when it comes to their standards of living. But for a general population where the bulk of Americans, again, I know it's it's bad to look at excluding the minority group, but at the overall whole of America, we were doing very successful during this time period, and we had achieved a really high standard of living, all the way from like the people that are college educated and businessmen, all the way down to factory workers. One of the big things that's helped stimulate that economy was this GI Bill that FDR introduced in 1944. And what it was, because we had so many general enlisted soldiers coming home from war, there was this guaranteed government loans to provide for education and housing and businesses, which will really spur economic growth. Because you think about it, when you are given a loan to go to college, you're going to get out of college earning more money and contributing more tax dollars. When you get a loan to buy a house, you're going to be contributing to the economy by filling the house with goods and hiring people to service that house and housekeepers and yard maintenance people and people, plumbers and electricians to build that. When you open a business with a loan, you're going to hire people to work to those businesses and to help contribute to the small business economy. So this is going to really help spur economic growth. And also we had a showing that we had a really good sense of safety and income and a safety net in America. We see a huge growth of baby and childbirth in America from 1945 to 1960. We call this the baby boom, where any children born from this, and you could even extend this into the early 60s as well. So it shows a confidence in America's economy. People are having more kids, getting married earlier. Also, they were moving away from the cities and into suburbs, which is going to allow them to have a bigger house and a bigger family because they have more space to fill it. And this was going to contribute to the suburban growth. We're going to see new demand for housing outside cities, especially for middle-class, economic level Americans. Levittown was going to be the first major suburb planned community, and it's going to really encourage this family unit to be pushing out to the suburbs. One big problem of this, though, is also when white families and middle-class families left the cities, what they were also leaving and taking with them was not just themselves, but their money and their tax dollars as well. So when that revenue left inner cities, we see a major effect, one of these cause and effect relationships, where many of the more well-to-do people left the inner cities and then moved to the suburbs, taking their tax dollars with them, meaning that these inner cities had less tax revenue to work with, meaning that they're going to not be able to educate the kids in those cities as well, or fund the police departments, or fund the fire departments, or fund streets. And the businesses that relied on those well-to-do families that patronated those businesses now are going to dry up, and they're going to basically not be able to afford to stay there. They're going to move out. So we start really seeing the inner cities become impoverished and very racially divided. So in the north, we didn't really have forced segregation, where it wasn't like blacks and whites were forced to separate and not eat in the same counters and go to different schools. But because of the white flight, it was called, of going to the suburbs, we see a very much more racially divided inner city, and it becomes this very sort of hard thing that is like this downward spiral of like racial diversity, racial division and a lot of poverty in the cities, which is eventually going to sort of get switch. Back in the 80s and 90s, we're going to have a growth of inner city growth. But it's going to take about 50 years, for 40 years, to really start rejuvenating these inner cities. So here's Levittown, the very first planned community. And one of the songs, I'll play it for you in class if you guys ask. I totally forgot I was going to play it right now too, but it's called Little Boxes by Marvano Reynolds, also done by Pete Seeger. And it's talking about like this, the calamity of this new suburban life. And we'll talk about that, and actually it's a great sort of song and poem, you could say. It actually has come up in the AP test in sort of characterizing what 50s suburban life was like. So Little Boxes. I'll play it to you in class in a couple of days. And of course, it was the white suburban family, 3 to 4 kids, a dog, in these suburban homes. Also, we see a flight of people and migrating to Sunbelt states, especially in California, Florida, and Texas, and to some extent Phoenix in Arizona and Atlanta in Georgia. Especially California, because so much of the defense industries were positioned there, and in Southern California, and so you could see huge amounts of people coming out west for the defense industries. And you see a lot of people leaving Ohio and Indiana and Pennsylvania and Michigan and flooding into Florida and Georgia and Texas and California. And so also this is going to be a political shift as well, because if you think about it, the old really populous states had all the electoral power. Were these like New York's and Pennsylvania's and Illinois' and Ohio's and Michigan's, like those are the big like electoral power states. And that's going to be shifting down to Florida, Texas, California. And again, with Illinois and New York still being two very large, important electoral states as well. Okay, so some post-war politics. Some politics of the post-war. So you had Truman and Eisenhower as the two ones. We're going to talk about Truman today in this lecture, and then we'll talk about Eisenhower the next. So after World War II, we do see the war and all the basic governments basically I can't think of the word, their control of the economy, really keeping inflation low. But when the Office of Price Administration sort of ended their rule of the economy, we see inflation skyrocket about 25%. Truman really wanted to keep some of these inflational tools and these government checks on the economy, but the Southern Democrats and Republicans sort of merged and forced him to end some of these World War II economic controls. Also within the economy, we're going to see major industries like the railroads and mining and the workers going on strike, crippling those industries. And Truman's actually going to get involved, breaking those strikes, forcing those workers back to work so it doesn't ruin the whole American economy. For the most part, civil rights during these 50s eras is sort of at a standstill for several reasons. We'll get to them a little later on in the next chapter. But Truman did really try to overhaul and redo a lot of the civil rights legislation. Unfortunately, he was blocked by a lot of the Southern Democrats and more conservative Republicans. So not really much gets done civil rights-wise with Truman. The one thing that he does do, that he has legislation or constitutional power over to do himself, is he actually does desegregate the military, which is a big step forward. So it's going to be the first time that American men are going to be fighting in integrated units since the Spanish-American War. And during the Korean War that starts in 1950, we are going to see integrated units going to Korea. So, after 16 years of Democratic rule, under FDR's basically 4 terms, we do see the Congress finally sort of switching to a more conservative Congress, more Republican-based Congress. This also basically will bring in a very conservative decade of the 1950s. Not only will Congress become more conservative, the 50s itself will also become more conservative as well. So we can also look at patterns. We look at the 1920s, the 1950s, the 1980s, all as decades that bring in new conservative values after decades of more progressive ideas. So the 1920s came right after the progressive reforms of the teens. The 50s came after basically 12 years of New Deal legislation and war. The 80s comes after a huge push of 60s civil rights, and 70s, 70s were a weird decade we'll get to later on. It's hard to explain just one comment. But we see a lot of similarity between those 3 decades, and all 3 decades are dominated by a very conservative Republican Congress. One thing the Congress does pass is the Taft-Hartley Labor Act. Unions call this the Slave Labor Act. It is basically a rollback of unionization and a rollback of FDR's New Deal Wagner Act. This Wagner Act basically gave workers and unions more rights and more power, and this will be a rollback of those powers. It will check the power of unions by doing a lot of things. One of the big ones was outlawing closed shop unions. Truman does veto this bill. He does side with the unions and the laborers, but because Congress has a majority of Republicans, they're able to override his veto and still pass this. In the election of 1948, we see the Democratic Party split. Truman's push for civil rights does break up the Democratic Party by the Southern Democrats forming their own party known as Dixiecrats. Those Dixiecrats will nominate Strom Thurmond from South Carolina as their presidential candidate, as a Southern Democrat. They don't call themselves Democrats, they call themselves states' rights Democrats. But it does push the party. So the Republican running had a really strong thought that he was going to win because of the split party. Dewey thought he was going to win. Most pundits thought that Dewey was going to run away with it. Truman campaigned feverishly up even till the very election night. And he barely squeaked it out. It was a very close election. If you look at the popular vote, that's where the closeness was. The electoral vote wasn't really close at all, but the popular vote was a pretty damn close election, as you can see right there, with neither person getting over 50% of the popular vote. And here's a couple of cartoons. There's one cartoon of basically right before the election. There's Dewey on the right, Truman on the left, and Dewey saying, what's the use of it going through the election anyway? Because everyone was thinking that Dewey is just going to basically landslide this victory. And you see all here. And even as the election was going on, some newspapers, as election results were coming in, showed that Dewey was doing really well early on in the night, and actually started printing up these newspapers that Dewey defeats Truman. In reality, of course, Truman does defeat Dewey and stays a Democrat, the president, for another 4 years until 1952. And Truman's economic plan is going to be very similar to Roosevelt's plan. The problem is that Truman doesn't have the backing of Congress like Roosevelt did. And Truman didn't have the era of the Great Depression to push the need to have these large, sweeping governmental programs to get America going again. America in 1948, 1949 was doing pretty well economically. Not as good as in the mid-50s, but pretty well. And a lot of people were like wanting to roll back some of these big governmental programs after, again, 12 years of war and Great Depression. So even though Truman had proposed for education reforms and civil rights and public housing and national health care, pretty much almost every single of these programs were blocked by Congress. And here's a great one. There's Truman laying this big old egg, and you see all the ducks of Congress sort of laughing about it because, so he's laid it, now some of these ducks have to hatch it. And none of these ducks really want to. He has a Democratic president, Republican Congress. Not much is going to get done. Okay, on world affairs, though, very different, very different. Huge amounts of things were happening on a global foreign policy level. So let's look at first what sets up this Cold War to begin with. Okay, so we have to look at the things that happened during the war at the very tail end of it, okay? First thing, we're going to see that the United Nations is going to be formed when the war is still going on as a united body of world nations. It was basically a very stronger world organization, very similar to the League of Nations back in World War I, and with much more power. Every nation is going to be part of it, and every nation has a vote for one. On this United Nations, there's a Security Council with 11 members. 6 of them are rotating, and 5 of them are permanent. Those 5 permanent members are China, Russia, America, Great Britain, and France. Those 5 members. The rest of those 6 members rotate between 6 ones. And the 5 permanent members basically have permanent veto power, which means that any action that is decided by the General Council in the UN can be vetoed one way or another. So, and that happens, where you can see a lot of bickering and going back and forth, because you're going to see Russia or Soviet Union and America having a lot of odds with each other within this United Nations. And the United Nations will be headquartered in New York City. Okay, some of the conferences that set up the issues of World War or the issues of the Cold War. So these conferences happen at the very tail end of the war in 1945, just as Germany was going down to defeat. So Yalta Conference was still going on when Germany was still at war with, and America was still at war with Germany. This was a meeting between Churchill, Stalin, and FDR in Yalta, which is a little area of the Black Sea where the Soviet Union is. What was decided in Yalta was that Poland was going to be controlled by the communists as a buffer state, and then Germany and Berlin was going to be divided into 4 separate zones, with each zone being protected and governed by England, America, France, and Soviet Union. And Berlin's going to be separated the same exact way. And so here's that. So you see French, British, American, and the Russian zones of Germany, and Berlin being divided, again, in the same sort of fashion. And the problem with this is, look where Berlin's at. Berlin is smack dab in the middle, actually farther to the right and east in East Germany, where the Russian zone is. And that's going to be a problem, and we'll talk about that problem in a little bit. Okay, FDR dies, and Churchill basically leaves his prime ministership. And right as the war ended in Germany, and we were still going to war in Japan, we have another conference called the Potsdam Conference. In this conference, Truman basically pushes for Germany not to have any reparations, which means we're not going to have a repeat of World War I where Germany owes the world like billions of dollars they can't afford. That's a win for America. We didn't really want a weak Germany. We wanted a strong Germany. Again, a strong capitalist Germany to withstand communism and withstand Russian aggression, as well. Okay, so origins of the Cold War. We see the origins of the Cold War really sit with these two superpowers now coming out of World War II with extreme amount of power. The United States, with the largest economy in the world and access to the nuclear bomb. Soviet Union had gained control of most of Eastern Europe, huge amount of resources, and communism was this new sort of form of politics and government that sort of had a lot of allure to it. That could be pushed to well, if you're doing poorly, if you're war-torn, maybe communism actually appeals a little bit. In regards to satellite nations, again, Soviet Union controlled, not directly, but indirectly, all these countries of Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, Albania, Bulgaria. They sort of pushed their communism politics into those countries. And they wanted those countries to be very loyal to the Soviet Union. So they're going to basically provide them with military and provide them with aid, again, because they really wanted to create a buffer zone between the heartland of the Soviet Union and Germany and those Western Bloc countries. And when this happens, Winston Churchill in Indiana basically coined this phrase in the speech he did. He basically, an iron curtain has fallen across Europe, which means that basically this line between communist East and non-communist capitalist West. And again, this wasn't literally an iron wall that was divided. This is just a border between communism and non-communist states. There's this iron curtain. The reason this is in sort of dark blue or gray is that Yugoslavia actually was communist, but they were a non-Soviet communist nation, so which means that they controlled their own communist country without the fingers of Russia and Soviet Union basically intertangling in there. I love this cartoon because you see the Soviet octopus basically reaches its tentacles all across Asia and Korea and into all sorts of different areas of the Middle East and Europe, all sorts of places. So America started to come up with this idea. And here it got its name through George Kennan. He was a part of the U.S. State Department in Moscow, and he had found out about the Soviet sort of tactics. And it was called the Long Telegram. And basically, this telegram detailed the Soviets' refusal to cooperate, and the U.S. should have a policy of keeping the Soviets from expanding their communism influence to other areas. And so containment could be through diplomatic, military, or economic means. Basically keeping communism checked, making sure communism does not spread to other parts or other countries of the world. There was no way to defeat communism within the boundaries of the Soviet Union. But the goal was to not have communism spread to areas that had not previously had it. Containment. One way to do it is to make sure those areas were rich. Make sure those areas were well-to-do economically. And that's where the first level of containment came in. Truman's Marshall Plan was proposed by Secretary of State George Marshall, and that would give billions of dollars of aid to help rebuild Europe and give loans to Europe and give money to Europe in aid and basically offer to any country that wants it, even the Soviet Union and communist bloc countries. The thought is if those countries were doing well, their economy was thriving, there'd be no reason why they'd want to take in communism. Why would you want, if you're a small business owner, why would you want to have communism and have your business run by the state? That's what the thought. The thought was that basically a strong economic Europe is a strong political Europe for democracy. And these are the countries that took our aid. So you see Sweden, and even though Sweden wasn't in the war, she was neutral. So was Switzerland. They took her aid. Iceland and Ireland and England and France and West Germany and Belgium and Netherlands and Italy. So even Italy, who was one of the Axis powers, took it. Greece and Turkey. Who didn't take it were those Eastern Bloc countries and the Soviet Union. And the thought was, I love this cartoon, is that basically you have the American taxpayer pulling the bike along. The bike is Europe, right? Europe is sleeping because it is struggling after World War II. The Marshall Plan is a bike, and the bike is leading Europe to self-support. And of course, who's paying for it? The American taxpayers. And of course, with the Soviet Union, they don't want a European recovery. The Soviet wants a downtrodden, economically impoverished Europe, because then communism looks more appealing. Make sure you write that down. That again, the Soviet Unions want countries that aren't doing well financially and economically. Because again, then communism looks like a more appealing political, economic, philosophical ideology. Okay. Another way to contain communism is by force. The Truman Doctrine was that force. So we have two instances basically of Greece and Turkey, both countries that are very near the Soviet Union, and both held a really vital passageway. So you have the Black Sea, and you have a lot of military ports on the Black Sea. And Turkey controlled the inlet to go in and out of this Black Sea. So the Soviets really wanted to control both Greece and Turkey potentially. So they put huge amounts of money into local communist factions within those countries to try to get them to turn against their countries and turn them communist. America didn't really want to get involved and start another war right away. So what we did, we gave huge amounts of aid, huge amounts of money to Greece and Turkey for them to fight against communism. So instead of putting our military in Greece or Turkey, we put our money into Greece and Turkey. And both those countries did stave off and stop communism spread there. So I love this cartoon here. You see Truman right there. And to fight communism, he's not fighting with bullets. Look right there, he's fighting with dollar bills. And there you go see, I'm thinking that that's the White House right there. Maybe, I don't know. It sort of looks like a White House, maybe. Okay, most likely this is not going to come in the AP test, but something else that was created is the National Security Act. And what it was is basically a streamlining of U.S. agencies to streamline them together to make them work more efficiently in a military foreign policy way. Probably is not going to come up on test, but if you ever get a test question about the Cold War and ways America changed because of the Cold War, we did change our government organization to streamline more efficiently so we can, again, stave off foreign attacks and other things like that. Okay, Berlin. Let me take a drink of water real quickly. So Germany was divided, like we said, into those 4 zones. And what happened is that a couple things happened that pissed off the Soviets. One, basically, we formed NATO. We'll get to that in a couple slides, what NATO is. But another one is that America, England, and France all sort of combined their 3 zones together into this free zone. And so what the Soviet zone did, they basically blockaded that whole border between the Eastern Soviet zone and those other 4 Western zones. And Berlin was divided the same way. And so we see that basically the Soviets were dividing off those areas. And the reason why is that basically we wanted a strong Germany, promote recovery. The Soviets wanted a weak Germany, and they wanted to keep a Germany there, to keep it weak so they wouldn't have the ability to attack and start another war again, pretty much. So Soviet Berlin blockade, on June 23rd, 1948, USSR blocks all roads and rails into West Berlin. Again, the Soviets wanted the U.S. out of Berlin. They were wanting to basically push the American hand so we would just basically give them Berlin. They wanted no Western capitalistic city in the heart of a communist country. And so they were trying to force us out without having to military take it. Well, a blockade technically is a military aggression act. So America would have every right to basically do a couple things. We could basically hand over Berlin to Stalin and say it's not worth it. We can give Stalin and West Berlin to the Soviets, whatever. We could order U.S. troops to force open the roads and rail, which of course it would be our right to do, but it would provoke war. Or we could basically just airlift supplies into Berlin until the blockade was blocked and removed. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to have this huge year-long airlift. It lasted a year, and we airlifted about 2 million tons of supplies into West Berlin. And not just like clothing and food, but we're talking about coal and other heavy supplies as well. And everything, not like pretty much the only thing that they would have that they had and made their own was water. Otherwise, everything had to be lifted in food and clothing and materials and consumer goods and everything. Everything you could think of needed, because again, Berlin was just a city. It had no farms, had no really production means besides their city. And it worked. We see here the great thing with Truman and Stalin both playing chess. And I love this one right here. You see this corner piece, and that's probably basically representing the atomic bomb, the thing that the Americans had that the Soviets did not yet have. And it was a complete disaster for the Soviets. Stalin was seen as a brutal dictator almost there. The U.S. was seen as a sympathetic, humanitarian nation, and it gave the world a sense of backing the U.S. In a moralistic way during this time period. Okay, at the same time period, like we said, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had formed. Basically, U.S., Canada, and 10 other European nations to have an alliance together to combat the spread of USSR and communism. USSR responded by creating the Warsaw Pact, which is now defunct. It's not around anymore. NATO is still around, and it still is basically a organization to make sure that Russia does not get too aggressive, even today. And here's based on the NATO members. And you see Stalin being all pissed off about that, encircled in warmongering with an Atlantic Pact. And we have the arms race. Of course, at this time period, the U.S. did have the atomic bomb, and we were testing new things like the hydrogen bomb. And of course, the Soviets will be pushing to develop their own atomic weaponry as well. And they figured that out in 1949 when they exploded their first atomic bomb. Because of that, we're going to see a huge increase of defense spending and defense budgetary around the atomic weaponry and hydronuclear bombs as well. I like this cartoon where we see atomic bomb. If you have it, you have world control, but also by using it, you have world destruction. Okay, Cold War in Asia. We see the Cold War moving to Asia with China being the forefront of this. China, prior to World War II, was going through a civil war. And then basically the rebels, and when Japan attacked China, had sort of been put a halt to any civil war movement. When the war was over, Americans backed the Nationalist Party and a guy named Chiang Kai-shek. The People's Republic of China and the communists were backed by Mao Zedong. And eventually, Mao and his People's Army are going to push the nationalists off the Chinese mainland. Off the Chinese mainland and onto Taiwan. And so the Nationalist Party, there's Mao again right there, basically left the mainland China and then fled to Taiwan. They call themselves the Republic of China of Taiwan. And China calls them the People's Republic of China. Excuse me. And China, still to this day, claims that Taiwan is a renegade state of China. And still considers Taiwan part of the Chinese mainland, basically, but as a breakaway state under rebellion. And the Korean Peninsula had been divided at the end of World War I, right along that 38th parallel, with the northern half being given to Russia to control, and the communist government there, and the south being given to the U.S. to control, and their U.S. government, with the hope of reuniting the peninsula at some other time. Well, that never happens. We have this theory called domino theory, where we think that if one territory or nation falls, others around it will also fall as well, like dominoes. The thought is, if we let Korea fall to communism, well, that would affect maybe Japan or Vietnam or Taiwan or Thailand or the other Asian countries as well. So when North Korea attacks the South on June 25th, 1950, it was vital that we keep it and we don't let it fall to communism like China did. So Truman immediately went to the UN and basically asked for UN support to stop this attack. Well, luckily, the Soviet Union had been boycotting the UN at that time period, and so we were able to get the basic UN to vote on this and allow the UN to support backing South Korea. Again, that was because Soviet Union had been boycotting this UN. And so Douglas MacArthur will be in charge of this war, and he'll basically invade Korea and push North Korea back to the Chinese border. And so basically, the war happens, North Korea goes down to the south and pushes South Korea all the way down to this little bubble right here. Okay, and then basically the MacArthur and the UN and Americans will basically land actually behind enemy lines and then make North Korea then retreat all the way back up to the Yalu River. So basically you see the North pushing the South down, and then once America gets involved, pushing the North all the way back up almost to the Chinese border right there where there's the Yalu River. At that point, China decides to join the battle on the north side. And at that point, they push the U.S. and the South Korea back across the 38th parallel, and it goes back and forth, right along that area right there. MacArthur wants to actually attack China with nuclear weapons if necessary. Truman says no. MacArthur criticizes Truman, and then Truman fires MacArthur. And so we have this dilemma: do we go to a bigger war with China? Well, again, obviously, Korean War was going to be big as well. We were going to have 20,000+ men die in this war, and it was going to be huge losses for Korean civilians. What happens though? We basically sign a ceasefire. A ceasefire line was established, and a split Korea will happen. Korea technically is still at war with each other. So North and South still have a military border, and technically still the Korean War has not ended. It's just not actively going on. And so the line of demarcation is this dotted line. So pretty much almost the same line as a 38th parallel to begin with. The North gets a little more on this western side, and the South gets a little more on this eastern side. And the only crossing is this one military buildup border right there in Panjimon. The losses were huge. You see there huge amounts of dead here, about 30,000 U.S. soldiers, huge amount of Korean soldiers, about 500,000 dead soldiers, with another 500,000 of wounded or missing soldiers. On the communist side, much bigger numbers. The dead number about 700,000, and the wounded missing in action. So total, we have almost 2 million of the North in China, either dead, wounded, or missing in action. And civilian lives are about 2 million civilians will lose their lives in this, both North Koreans and South Koreans. So really devastating for the Korean Peninsula. And again, today it still is a military border. You see this, it's very militarized. There is no back and forth. There is no travel back or forth. South Koreans cannot go north, and North Koreans cannot go south. And here's the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. Okay, the last section, the second Red Scare. So politically in America, we were going through another wave of fear of communism in America. So the Red Scare. This Red Scare was not as realistic, though. In the 1920s, there was a realistic thought that maybe America was turning a little bit socialist. We had so many Eastern European immigrants. We had so much laborers that were bad off. The thought was like, could America really sort of push for a communist socialist revolt? And there was some thoughts about that. But this 1950s, there was no chance of a communism takeover in America. America was doing way too well economically. We are a strong capitalist country. Our democracy was going really well. This is more just tactics to put the scare in Americans, to put fear into communism to justify some of our political actions. So really, this was a more false Red Scare used to just to propagate, propagate their version of what was really going on. Okay, so one thing that happened was the Federal Employee Loyalty Program, or FLEP. 1947, Truman was being attacked on being too weak than communism. So he created this program to sort of look into our government, to search out and seek out any communist in the American government. In reality, that probably put more fear into Americans than doing nothing at all, because the thought is like, if the government's actually putting energy into seeking out communist infiltrators, well, there probably is going to be communist infiltrators. Part of this is going to be the HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committees. To run all these investigations, you're going to have this internal organizations set up within Congress. Richard Nixon is going to become the leader of that. It's going to investigate communism within the U.S. government, and it's going to push to investigate ties within both the Truman and FDR administrations. And of course, I love this because the House American Committee is basically putting a big stain on the Bill of Rights. The thought is that, isn't it freedom of speech to have your own political ideologies? Couldn't I believe in communism and have that be fully okay in American society with our Bill of Rights? Okay, so the red hunt begins. People are being blacklisted, their lives are destroyed, and not just governmental people, people with influence. So we're searching out people that are professors and radio show hosts and TV personalities and movie editors and producers and actors. We're looking at clergy and Congress people. All sorts of people are being accused and blacklisted. A couple famous people took the stand and were tried. Alger Hiss, being a top government official, was tried and was found guilty of having communist ties and being a spy. And probably the most extreme case was Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were communist spies that were leaking to the communist and Soviet Union top secret atomic bomb weaponry secrets. And they were both tried of espionage and put to death. In 1950, with Congress, passed the McCarran Act. And basically, Truman vetoed this, but Congress will override his veto. What this is the communist groups would have to be required to register with the federal government. All communist activities would be outlawed, and communists would basically be revoked passports or working in anything defense-related. What Truman said about this is that in a free country, we punish men for crimes they commit, but not for opinions they hold. And so we see that Congress is becoming extremely conservative and extremely wanting to almost suppress rights of people, which will play into Republican Joseph McCarthy's McCarthyism. He's going to be a senator from Wisconsin that's going to be very, very, very hard on communism. He's going to be the leader of pushing for allegations and finding people and accusing people of being communist in the name of fighting communism. So in 1947, he starts this. He claims that he has a list of 205 communists working in the State Department. Even though he never produces this list, people still take him for his word and seriously. And they allow him to start trials and start bringing people into the Congress and start trying it and basically asking, have you or are you a communist member to people, and just randomly throughout the government. And Congress allowing him to do that. Eventually, though, he steps on the wrong toes. He starts bringing in people in the U.S. military. He even starts, contemplating maybe Truman or Eisenhower or even some generals are communist sympathizers. So that goes too far. Senate will eventually vote to condemn him, and he'll be sent into exile, basically. And basically, after his term is up, he's not re-voted into Congress. There's a lot more to do with the Cold War. This is basically Truman's Cold War. The next chapter is going to focus on the 1950s and Eisenhower during the Cold War, which we'll get to later this week. Have a great night, guys, and we'll see you guys in class on Tuesday. Bye all.